So today we are going over usability, accessibility, and user testing. So this is something we've talked about where when a client or a potential user is testing out the application you're building, we have to make sure, well, is it even usable, right? Are we in a position where our product is ready to really go to the masses, or do we need to take it back and reconsider a few things? So by the end of this lesson, we should be able to understand how to implement usability and accessibility best practices in web design, conduct user testing to gather feedback and improve designs, and then also being able to understand how to create websites that are inclusive and cater to diverse user needs. Okay. So why user interviews, right? So let's think about this for a minute. We've kind of talked about the benefit of getting user interviews already, right? So what are some of those? I'm going to kind of step back for a second. What from last week, what do you remember being benefits for user interviews? And maybe there's something that we didn't cover, or maybe you can think of what might be an issue if we didn't have them, right? So let's take a minute kind of as a warm up and let's talk through what we could actually benefit from when it comes to user interviews. All right, so Joseph says to understand the needs of the user when developing products. Okay. So I think there's a little bit of another side of that, right? Is, that's something that we have to kind of think through as we're developing, right? Whether it's as an independent contractor or maybe you are a product designer, right? Like you kind of have to think through that already. But to your point, as people use your product, you start understanding, well, maybe there's things that we missed, right? Or maybe what we had intended isn't working as expected. Okay. Not seeing anything else coming through. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think that's something it's good to think about the positive and the negative side, right? Is how can they help us, but also what do we lose when we don't have those interviews? So, okay. So we've already kind of talked about this, right? And again, I wanted to at least sometimes I think it's easier to think about things when it's not on the screen. It forces us to use our brain in a different way. So, with this question here, this knowledge check, why user interviews, it says either learn how to create a product, understand how products work, ensure products work the way they are intended in the hands of users, understand how designers and research created them, and most importantly, to empathize with users. I think we would agree it's going to be this one here in the middle, right? Making sure things are working the way as expected. At the end of the day, it's one of those things where I don't know if overseas you all have watched Parks and Rec much. If you have, you can throw it in the chat. But there is an episode where they're trying to solve a a project by the end of the day so that their department doesn't get shut down, right? And they think an easy thing to do would to figure out, well, why are people using the water fountains incorrectly? Like they put their whole mouth over the splash guard, and it's just absolutely disgusting. And you think about it, and you're like, well, that's clearly not how this was designed, right? The splash guard is just meant to keep the water from splashing up. You're not meant to put your entire mouth over it. So the way they solved that was just take the splash guard off, so there's no putting a mouth on it, right? My point in that is you can make something, but it's not always going to be used the way that it's intended, right? So that's where that user testing and getting feedback is so vital. So again, thinking through the importance, right? So user interviews are typically one-on-one sessions that it's going to help the product team really understand, how people perceive the application. There's a certain element where perception is truth, right? And what I mean by that is how people see something is how they perceive it to work or to be implemented or set up. And it doesn't mean that's true, right? It's just that's how we perceive things. And you've heard that idea, your truth is your truth. And we tend to get very deep-seated ideas from that first impression. So during these interviews, and sometimes it can be a group interview, right? But typically it's more personal one-on-one. Designers and whoever else is involved in the meeting really can understand, okay, so this is how we handed it off, but how is it actually being used? And what we have in mind, is that actually coming across, or is something being missed, right? Are we possibly not delivering the product that we're expecting? So we're going to look at a couple different user interviews in this session. We're looking at structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. And I think the names are pretty self-explanatory, but as always, there's always some context that is important to understand here. Um, and something else to consider too is when we're talking about interviews, we're not talking like a 5-minute interview, but we're also not talking hours either, right? Typically, it's anywhere from a half hour to an hour. In person, virtual doesn't really matter. But again, we interviews are also important to actually be real users, right? There's no benefit to having someone where it's just like looking at a screenshot and they've never interacted with it, right? It's someone who's actually used your product. So qualitative user research is one approach, and we're also going to talk about quantitative as well. So we had kind of briefly mentioned this prior, but qualitative is more in regards of non-numerical data, right? So thoughts, behaviors, feelings, motivations, perceptions. Whereas qualitative, that is really, I guess, the benefit here is you think about how, especially when it comes to like and not in a negative sense, but politics, right? Or maybe you're thinking about making a vacation trip or even a job, right? Certain things will matter when it comes to data, right? But ultimately, people are typically persuaded by how they feel, how they perceive an employer, how maybe their social media posts, right? So things that you like, dislike, it doesn't mean that numerical data is completely divorced from this, but it's typically more of the emotive side. And that's where we could think about, I'm just throwing an example out there, maybe someone's dealing with stocks, right, and dealing with trading. The application could handle your investments perfectly, but if it's not easy to use, if the user experience is, maybe you've run into this before, but it's almost kind of like demeaning. And what I mean by that is it talks down to you, it holds your hand way too much. You're always getting ads, even if, yes, it's a free application, but like you can't even go from screen to screen without ads. There's certain things here that will color our perception about a product, even though the core root of the product actually works well. Right. So there's a lot of things to consider when you do this user research. It's not just, do you like the app? Does the app work? It's also, do you feel like your time is respected? Do you feel like you can access everything that you need? Do you feel like you're getting the support you need? There's so many different things. And that's where with user interviews as well, you might want to focus on a certain portion, right? It's not always a holistic interview. It might just be focusing on new features, or it might be focusing on a certain aspect of uh, an application, like you have A/B testing, which we've talked about prior. So going into the different kind of interviews that we had mentioned in the last page. So structured interviews can be scripted, right? Every interview is going to be the same. Even if someone brings up another point, they're like, "Oh, that's really good." You stay on script, right? You really want to have that control group where, how many hours did you use the application? Were you able to log in? All these different things, right? Every single user is going to be interviewed the same way. You try to have the questions be closed-ended because you really don't want to have too much variation in your answers. You want to be able to take that data, even if it is qualitative, but you still want to be able to kind of break it down into like multiple choices, so to speak. So that way it's easier to view your results at the end of it. But then you also have semi-structured. And this is where you typically have the same questions, but they're a little bit more open-ended. And that's where you get those follow-up questions, right? You might change the order, but you're still asking the same questions. You're just allowing for a little bit more flexibility in regards to maybe someone tells a story about, how they use the application. So it's not just a blanket, either X, Y, or Z. Maybe they're talking about W, right? And then all of a sudden they get onto another point, and then the interviewer can ask a follow-up question because they're allowing it to go a little bit outside of bounds, but the question is still related, right? So there is structure, but there's more flexibility here. And then you have unstructured. And this is where like this last part here is really important. This is not the kind of interview you just want to do without any preparation at all. And what I mean by that is someone needs to understand like what will happen if you ask someone a question and they go out of bounds, right? So if any of you have kids, you understand you can ask them a question, or they'll talk about a story, and all of a sudden it's just completely like out in left field. You're like, we weren't even close to that, right? And you have to be able to corral them in, the idea of like herding cats. You can't let them stray too far. You need to be able to ask a question. If they start going off topic, you can be like, hey, you know what, yeah, that's a great point, but let's get back to what we were talking about, right? And also, if it's unstructured, you may not have a lot of questions. And if you don't have that order, you could get to this rut of being like, well, I don't know how to segue from that last question to now. And it does kill the vibe, so to speak. So you really don't want to inadvertently kill your momentum. So with those probing questions, again, it takes some experience, right? So it could be something, someone shares a story about using the application. You're just asking a simple question of, tell me more about, your experience there, or, why did you do that, right? What made you do that? There again, there has to be an intentionality there, especially understanding if someone's already explained that, you don't want to ask a probing question that makes it sound like you weren't listening. And what I mean there is you clearly weren't listening if you ask a probing question they've already answered. So, so when it comes to timing, it's really important to understand the best time to do this, right? So you're not going to necessarily want to do everything at the beginning, but you don't want to necessarily wait till the end as well. So really, the interesting thing here is when you're involved in the design process, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a right or wrong way, but this is where prototypes can be really helpful, right? So instead of going full to production and putting a new feature in, you can have a prototype that people can use, and maybe they only want to test that specific feature, right? So that gives you the ability to test early, But there's also going to be times where you really just need to have that full integrated test, right? And you're going to have to wait till the end. So again, there's a point where you have to understand A, what you're testing, and then B, the right time to test. And there's not always going to be a black and white answer here. Um, I would argue you should always have tests towards the end, but sometimes you just need to put a feature into production. You don't want to overthink it, right? And you may have the time where it's not such a big deal to not do testing up front. Whereas you may have a huge feature that you want to get that user testing done up front so that you're not investing a lot of developer time into doing something that just isn't going to work at all. So again, it's kind of thankfully you're probably not going to have to be involved in that process, but it's definitely not super binary. Either you do it or you don't. So before I go to the next question here, again, I understand we're talking about a lot of things that may not be, your day to day, but hopefully, again, this is helping you understand as you are designing things to be mindful of, right? And even when it comes to projects, like we're going to go over Project 11 tomorrow, don't hesitate to reach out to Veronica and be like, hey, I want to try out this feature, but I'm not really quite sure how it's going to work. Let her take a look at it, right? Or have a friend, try it out as well. This is where it doesn't have to be super formal, right? You don't have to have paid users to test something out. You can use your friends and your connections to test these things for you. So I don't want you to feel like we're just talking about designers. These are things that, you can also be utilizing in a day-to-day process too. So when it comes to setting goals, this is where before you get too far, it's really good to have proper expectations, right? Understanding what should be happening through these interviews, when and how to get people involved, making sure you have the right questions, and then also setting up times and locations for those user interviews to take place, right? So when it comes to identifying your goals, what are you trying to even get out of this, right? Try to figure out what features do users find important. What again, you're creating this application, but like, what are people intending to do with your application, and were they able to do it? When it comes to recruiting, um, if you have an existing product, you can reach out to previous users, but if it's new, you might set up a Facebook targeted ad for people who are interested in similar topics, having them try out the application, or be like, hey, if you tried this application, um, we'd like some feedback. You could do a pop-up notice in the application to get people to sign up, right? Obviously, you could be really obnoxious with that, so please don't be. But I've seen that where it's like, hey, you've been using the application for so long. Would you mind sharing some feedback? It's not always like an actual user interview, but when you answer those questions, sometimes if you answer them in a way that intrigues the team, they may reach out for more information. Um, and then when it comes to questions, I feel like we've already talked about this enough, but there needs to be intentional questions, right? Not just being like, did you like our application? Well, why not? What would you change? Right? If I was on the other end, I'd be like, I don't know, I'm not getting paid for this. That's not my job to tell you like why it's not good. Again, I've agreed to it, but it changes the tone of the interview when you're not asking well-crafted questions. Okay. So, knowledge check. Let's go ahead and answer in the chat. When can interviews be conducted? Joseph saying throughout the design process. What else do we agree on that? All right. Let's see. I don't want to waste a vote. Yeah, that's correct. It's throughout the design process. Again, it's a continual process of getting data over and over. Um, Unless it's something, and something to think about too is there are some features where you're going to always want feedback, but then there's going to be times where maybe it's enough, right? And you're like, okay, we feel good about this, and then we'll wait to get feedback. So, as always, there's a little bit of variability here. Okay, so more types of interviews. So, we saw a few other user interviews before, but now we have a couple concepts that we can consider as contextual, generative, and continuous, which kind of already hinted at this. So contextual interviews, again, this is how a user interacts. And what's interesting, I don't want to get too far off, but you do have tools. So is anyone here before I type this out? Has anyone heard the phrase or the tool Adobe Target Tracking or Adobe Analytics? Anything like that? Let's see if looks like Joseph's typing. I think I've heard analytics. Yeah. So, as always, I can't share an example of my code, but Adobe Analytics, it's not something you can do for free, right? It's an enterprise level, but this is something where you can track user behavior, right? So, there's limitless things you can do. You can target, how long does someone sit on a page? You can set up code to be like, hey, they opted for this, they didn't opt for this, and then you keep track of that, right? And you can look at the dashboard. So I say all of that because these contextual interviews are really important, right? I mean, you want to see how people are using the product as naturally as possible. But we're starting to see more things like Adobe Analytics where you're kind of tracking it already. And to be fair, like you're not tracking any personal data, right? You're not like taking their social security number or anything like that, but you are monitoring like, well, how do people actually even use our application? So contextual interviews are still important, but I've noticed a trend of being more of a silent contextual interview these days, where nowadays you can get more information and people are going to use it naturally because they're not even thinking about, well, is someone monitoring, what I'm doing? Again, it's not like any data is being sold. It's just, okay, how many people opted for this specific item, right? And you can keep track of that in other ways. But what you could do is be like, okay, so for how many people clicked on this button, how many went to this next part, and how many went to this next part, and you can really see this journey, and it's super neat. I think it's a really good way of really narrowing down how people use your products. But then you have generative interviews, and this is where it's typically done in the beginning because you want to understand, again, how do people plan on using your application or your product, and do they have a good experience, right? It allows people to narrow down, the interviews to narrow down what problems they may be trying to solve and getting that good feedback in the beginning. And then last, continuous interviews. We've already talked about this. It just goes from point A to point Z throughout the entire process. You're getting those questions, you're asking those questions rather, and you're getting that feedback so that it's not just hey, we created a new feature, now we're asking questions. It's also, hey, we're asking a bunch of questions in the beginning, but then we're not getting any feedback. It's step by step you're getting that feedback, which can make the process a bit slower. So you kind of have to account for that too. Is you really can, if you're trying to, as they say, ship new features, doing something like this isn't probably going to be the approach to take because you're going to need enough data to determine whether to implement that feature, whether to make changes. So it's every company is going to be a little bit different, and every feature is going to be a little bit different too. And then again, talking about open and closed-ended questions, right? So open-ended questions, really someone can answer however they want, right? So, how did using the application make you feel, right? You feel like you're back in therapy. A lot of different ways you could go with that question. But then close-ended questions, right? So, were you able to find the delete account button? Were you able to successfully reset a password, right? These here, what are your thoughts? How often? Describe how you felt. These are more open-ended questions, right? The closed-ended questions, again, are more of, were you able to do this? If you weren't able to do this, why not? And that's still a little more open-ended, but it's a follow-up to a closed-ended question. All right. And then we have another knowledge check here to understand the different kind of user interviews. So let's talk about this. Let's go one by one. So a generative interview, is that going to be A, B, or C? Is it going to be used to learn throughout the process in the very beginning or used continually? Okay. So we voted for B, which is correct. And then contextual, is that going to be used from users throughout the design process or used to continually observe how they interact with the product? So is it going to be A or C? This one almost seems like it could be the same thing, but it's not. So the contextual is actually going to be, yes, I mean, that's actually incorrect. So contextual is going to be used to how they interact with the product. I have a tendency to not check through that because I'm going through and having my own notes. But if we go back here and look, contextual, it's how it's observed throughout the product, right? So I'll make sure, or if Time, if you wouldn't mind flagging that, we can get that changed. But again, so you think about context, right? Your surroundings, what you are inside of. That's how we understand it's how you're interacting with it. So again, it's the actual terms. I cannot think of the last time, or if ever, I've heard, oh, this is the contextual interview. We're thinking of this from a contextual interview perspective. I never hear that. But I have been part of conversations where we have talked about, well, what happens when the user's actually using the application, you're watching them, right, use the application. That is contextual. And even if we don't use that phrase, that process is very vital to the development, product development lifecycle. So let's go back to qualitative and quantitative data. So when we interview users, you should be able to get some insights that are actionable. Okay. So what I mean by that is when you get this data, you should be able to do something with it. If you get a bunch of stuff that you can't do anything with, either you are asking the wrong questions, which is possible, or maybe you're just asking the wrong people, right? Maybe they weren't providing the information you actually needed to make changes. So again, that's where we look at qualitative and quantitative. Okay, so this should be able to help us understand the difference between the two. So qualitative is it's a story, right? It tells researchers why. Um, let's think about using the Amazon application. I know someone else had mentioned this prior. We're talking about account deletion, right? So let's go ahead in the chat. Let's talk about just think about a why. What when you use the application, to shop, right? I don't know anything about your internal applications. You know, what what are some frustrations you have when using the application? But what are some things that you also think work well? And again, I'm talking about the actual like iOS, Android application here. Um, I know on my end, again, to reiterate what we talked about before, it's almost impossible to find actual account settings, right? There's like, I don't have it installed right now, but I feel like there were, there's just too many options to narrow down what you need to do. All right, got a few people typing here. So, Tatiana, yes, I think this is great feedback. So, their internal algorithm, it does recommend things you've already bought, right? When it recommends things that you already bought, but it can be frustrating because you can't find something different unless you know exactly what you want. I think that's good, and that that kind of does go back to the website version too, but maybe that distinction is important. So let's think about it holistically. Yeah, it's something that they determine what is best for you, right? Well, you should look at these things. And we don't have the ability to opt out of that, right? We don't have the ability of just like, hey, I just want to see these things. Don't try to tell me what I want. Um, when it works, it's great. And then when it's not, well, it can get frustrating for sure. Joseph said I had some discount there, and yesterday I was trying to look for it, but couldn't find where it is. Yeah, I mean, again, I know we all know this, but I think just for the sake of our conversation here, let's move this back over. Right. So there's so many different settings here where it can be overwhelming, right? And to be fair, I mean that's how big Amazon has become. But I remember back in the day when it came to customer service, it's better now. Actually, I say that it's really not, right? So like I could go in here and select an item and then try to get support, right? And it feels like you have to go through 50 steps to even get any sort of help at all, right? Where it used to be just Amazon support, cool, start a chat, you're good to go. You didn't have to tie it to an item because maybe it wasn't about an item, right? Maybe it was about the Amazon driver who almost ran over your kid. And I'm not joking. But I can't tie that to an item, right? So it's as these companies scale, sometimes the actual information layout management can be a bit overwhelming to say the least. So that's where qualitative research really comes into play. Right now, whether a company actually utilizes that or not, that's hard to say. But that's the point is how is it making us feel? They're not trying to get, how long did it take to get to point A to point B, right? They're not asking how many times did you log in each week? They're really just trying to get a story from their users. And then we get into quantitative. Again, how much, how many? It's measurable, it's numeric. It doesn't mean there's no narrative involved, but it has to be able to be displayed through like through numbers, graphs, spreadsheets, things like that. I don't always think the lines are super distinct, right? Or the parties are distinct. I think sometimes you can blur the lines, but it is more in it's as objective with the data as possible, right? We're not really getting into again narratives and feelings and experiences. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share this, and I realized I did not select share audio, so give me 1 second. There we go. Okay.
What is the difference between qualitative and quantitative research? Is probably one of the most common questions I get when it comes to any kind of user research. Though a lot of things in research can be complex, the answer here really is not. Qualitative research answers why, while quantitative research answers how much and how many. So, why versus how much and how many. Qualitative research helps us understand both attitudes and behaviors. Attitudes being people's thoughts and beliefs. This is usually gathered from user interviews, focus groups, and diary studies. Behaviors being observations about people's approaches to tasks, collected through ethnographic approaches like contextual inquiry and direct observation. Quantitative research, on the other hand, helps us put numbers and statistical significance behind our experiences. Insights in quantitative methods are typically derived from mathematical analysis, since the instrument of data collection captures such large amounts of data that are easily coded numerically. A few quantitative methods include web analytics, A B testing, card sorting, tree testing, even eye tracking. Now, of these, the question is not which is better than the other, but rather when should I be using which? I'm going to do a side by side comparison to walk you through this, starting with the most basic, which is what we've already gone over. Qual answers why and how to fix something, where quant answers how much and how many. Now, when it comes to outcomes, in qual, findings are based on researchers' analysis, impressions, interpretations, even prior knowledge. In quant, findings are statistically meaningful results that are likely replicated in a different study. When it comes to participants, in qual, you only need a few, think a handful. In quant, you need many. And then when it comes to approaches, in qual, you'll be using kind of flexible approaches with a range of structured and unstructured methods. In quant, you'll have well-defined, strictly controlled study conditions. The question isn't which is better than the other, but really, when are you trying to do what? Are you trying to answer the whys and the whats, or are you trying to answer the how much and how many?
All right. Before we move forward, let's do our pulse check, right? Our temperature check. So, Time, if you could go ahead and throw that up in Zoom, that would be swell. All right, it looks like we've had a couple of votes, but probably should give another minute or so. So for the people who are saying they somewhat understand it, what are the things you'd like to clarify without us having to go over everything again, right? What are the things that don't make sense? And is it just not understanding how it applies to what you're learning? Because we could definitely contextualize some of this as well. I think sometimes with anything, if it feels too abstract, it's hard to understand, right? If you don't understand how you would actually be utilizing it. Give it another minute. I do see someone typing. How to practically utilize into a project. Great. So let's do this. Let's go over the next section, inclusive design. We're going to take a break after that. And then we do have the lab, but I think we can talk about how to incorporate a lot of this UI UX research work into like your day to day as well. Whether you're a freelance or you're working on a team. I think a lot of that context, unfortunately, is just missing. So let's do that. Okay. So Sarah, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. So let's talk about inclusive design, and then we'll take our break, and then we'll circle back around to that. So inclusive design, we've talked about this before, and if you see here, this is definitely an interesting setup, right, with the Braille and other features here too. So there's a wide spectrum of how to design like accessibly, right? Inclusive design. And this is something where, from a developer's perspective, it's not that you shouldn't think about it, but it really should be. Oh, there's someone else on broadcast screen that threw me out for a second. It really isn't your job, especially as an entry level engineer, to be worried about those things. And what I mean by that is you should be having people that are designing with all of this in mind. And when it comes to the development perspective, you should just be implementing what they've set up for you. Right. Now, there's certain things that you're going to have to do that the designer won't think about. And we've talked about like alt text and things like that. The designer is not going to tell you, hey, you need to add alt text to your inputs and your images. But that is part of your job. But your job isn't to create the UX, most likely. So that's where the designer is going to be in charge of things like that. Now, it's good to ask, right? Within reason. You don't want to try to question someone's job or capabilities, right? There has to be a proper way to do it. But if you think that certain things could be more inclusive, it's a great way to ask, right? Or it's a great thing to ask about. And in the right team dynamic, that's never going to be a bad thing. So, really, the goal just with inclusive design needs to be, how are others going to use this application, whether it's based on like visibility, or limited motor functions, having designs that are have good contrast with colors, right? We've talked about it so many different times, but there's a laundry list of things to consider. Okay. So let's think about this quick discussion point here. Julie wants to visit a cooking website, but Julie has a visual impairment. I didn't catch that last time. And we know that recipe sites are filled with ads. So what sorts of issues might Julie run into? So again, she has a visual impairment and she wants to visit a cooking website, but as we know, cooking websites typically have a bunch of ads. All right, Joseph, not sure. I love that you're answering even though you're not sure. Cookies and ads wasting her time before she gets what she wants to read. Yeah, so if it's hard enough to read something, having ads all over the place just it's first of all, it's a horrible experience for anybody, but for people who really struggle with being able to read things, I mean, yeah, you're in for a bad time. Um, I don't know if I still have my, let's see. Yeah, so things like this, right? So if I hit refresh, when you have these like pop-ups, it's not an ad, right? But it can get annoying when I'm just trying to scroll through. Then all of a sudden you have these extra, recipes, right? And I know there's other websites that have ads. This one's pretty low key. Um, let's see. Hey Grill, hey. Yeah. I still love this name. Um, maybe the cooking isn't necessarily the worst example. What I'm thinking of is there is a website if I want to check for like movie news or anything like that. I do let's see, morning spoilers. So I don't really want to post any spoilers, right? Because but this website here is notorious for having ads all over the place. Like if I can actually pull it up. Right, so here's new thing here they just released. So I scroll down up and I've got my ad blocker off, so I guess you wouldn't be able to see it either. I'm thinking of on my phone. It's bad. I can't like I'll scroll through trying to read content and the ads will cover the content, and then I'll try to scroll back up and then it'll cover that content, right? And it's a horrible experience. So obviously if you're just making a basic application, you're probably not going to have ads, right? Or, for example, working at H&R Block with tax stuff, I'm not going to put ads inside of our application, right? But for companies that do use ads, it really is important to be mindful of where they're at and what kind of experience people might be having. And that's where when you are actually testing and you get that feedback from users, if you're getting a continual trend of, yeah, I would love to read the content, but I can't when there are ads all over the place, and that's probably something to consider, right? Is how can we have our ads in a way that do not create a bad user experience or a poor user experience? So we're going to talk about how to design inclusively. Um, this is the idea of how really just trying to think of again a holistic perspective, right? A diverse group of people, not just how you would experience the website, but how other people would as well. And I know we had talked about WCAG before, right? The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So we're just going to play this quick video and then we'll get onto the whole legal concerns perspective. And to Joseph's point, yes, cookies are horrible. To give you the option of rejecting the cookies, they really make you work for it, and it's not a great user experience at all.
What is WCAG and why is it important? An introduction to Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. In this video, we will present the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, sometimes known as WCAG or WCAG for short. We will introduce the conformance levels and the 4 principles that govern WCAG 2.1. At the end, we will also give some examples of the guidelines in WCAG 2.1. Let's start! Web Content Accessibility Guidelines cover the information in a website, including text, images, forms, and other media. WCAG started out as some basic requirements for accessible content. As needs and technologies have changed, updated versions have been released. Version 2.0 is incorporated by reference into many other standards, primarily at government level. Version 2.1 builds on this with 17 further success criteria, including mobile interfaces, supporting cognitive impairments, responsive design, and supporting users with low vision. The WCAG guidelines are organized around 3 levels of conformance. Level A level AA, and level AAA. Level AA is the most common level specified in government and organizational standards and requirements. It is also the common level specified in lawsuits, settlements, and structured agreements. The guidelines are organized around 4 core principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. If any of these are not met, users with disabilities will be unable to use a site or application. Perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways they can perceive. This means that users must be able to perceive the information being presented. It cannot be invisible to all of their senses. Operable. User interface components and navigation must be operable. This means that users must be able to operate the interface and its controls. The interface cannot require interaction that a user cannot perform. Understandable. Information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable. This means that users must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the user interface. The content or operation cannot be beyond their understanding. Robust. Content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This means that users must be able to access the content as technologies advance. As technologies and user agents evolve, the content should remain accessible. Each of these 4 principles has a corresponding set of guidelines. There are 12 in total for WCAG 2.0 and 13 in total for WCAG 2.1, including text alternatives, time-based media, adaptable, distinguishable, keyboard accessible, enough time, seizures, navigable, input modalities, readable, predictable, input assistance, and compatibility. Each guideline has success criteria which address important access issues that specifically impact people with disabilities. They are all testable and for either A, AA, or AAA conformance level. Let's summarize. WCAG is a standard that defines how to make web pages accessible. It is broken into 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. The success criteria that make up the guidelines are organized by these principles. Each success criterion's level of conformance is defined by A, AA, or AAA. Government and corporate requirements generally adhere to AA conformance. Congratulations! You have reached the end of this introductory video on WCAG.
Don't know how many cohorts we've had with that video, but it's a lot. Um, Something to keep in mind is there was a part where it said there, like the user experience or whatever must be performable. And something that we can keep in mind there is not everyone is going to be able to use like a mouse, right? So that's where if your accessibility is on point, you should be able to be able to tab through on certain things, right? And be able to get to where you need to be. But that's where, like, look at this instance, for example, right? Like I'm trying to tab through and it's really not only is it really hard to kind of find where I'm at, but like because we have this embedded video now, like now I have to tab through all of these things to get to where I want to be, right? So that can be a lot for users. So I'm not saying, hey, never embed a YouTube video, right? There are ways to work with that, but just something to be mindful of is your page should be, you should be able to use your page with just the keyboard, right? That's something that is important to think about with mindfulness, except like, you know, maybe you have a digital signature thing, right? Where you're legally required, you have to sign on there. Okay, well, you can't sign with the keyboard, right? There would need to be some other tool for that person to use that, or maybe they need to go in person. There's always going to be exceptions, but just something to be mindful of with that. Now, when it comes to legal concerns, right? Yeah, we should be designing this way because we want people to use our application and not have a bad experience. But there are legal ramifications for uh largely for willful ignorance with that. Now sometimes there have been lawsuits where people didn't realize it was an issue, but the point is you don't want to leave a company open to that kind of litigation. Okay. This article through whoisaccessible.com, it provides some examples of websites that are compliant and non-compliant. Um, so if we go here, Air Choice One, it's an American airline that operates as a regional airline offering commuter flights, but they apparently have not made their site accessible. So here, right, keyboard focus helps users know where they are on the page as they tab through it. Um, if we go here, we may not have that, right? It's very, looks like maybe they've fixed it, but at that time, it looks like maybe that wasn't the case, right? So it's not amazing, right? But you can see here, I'm tabbing through. There is that border there to say this is where I'm at. Um, so then I can make my choices, right? Okay, I want to do one way, etc. Um, I will say, whenever you find articles like this, you have to be very careful that you look at the date because a lot of these articles are written for a certain time and place, and sometimes uh, they need to be updated. Now, the irony, I think, is unless there's something on my end, like I can't even scroll on this page at all. I'm having to actually tab through. So I don't know if that's intentional, but I'm having issues viewing their webpage, right? So just kind of funny there. New York Mag, apparently same thing, but I have a feeling that this has probably been updated since then. Um, yeah, like this here, you can see it's selected with the tab, but it looks similar to like a regular border, right? So that would be the argument of it's not visible enough to make, or it's not distinctive enough, right? The point is, this isn't supposed to be like, hey, you're looking at this page, they've got all these issues. It's more of even big companies can forget to do these things, or maybe it's a specific style choice. But unfortunately, with the legal ramifications and also just understanding how different people are going to view your web page or your application, um, it's really just important to be mindful of that, right? At the end of the day, it's not a huge deal to have a blue border around an element if you're tabbing through, right? It's not a bad thing. Maybe that was 20 years ago, but where we're at now, just demonstrate what's being targeted and we'll be good. Okay. What questions do we have about the inclusive design portion here? Anything that doesn't make sense or any concerns maybe about previous projects? Again, we're not trying to say, hey, if you didn't do any of this stuff, you did something wrong, right? It's hard you don't know what you don't know. So that's why we're trying to help encourage you to be mindful of these things. So any questions or thoughts about this section before we take a break? Give it a few more seconds here. Okay. Well, it is 31 after. Let's come back at 45 after. And then we will talk about this lab and then open it up as well for a little bit of time to talk about project 10 as it is due tomorrow. All right. Welcome back, everyone. So I wanted to demonstrate really quick the whole ad situation we talked about before. I had pulled this up in Chrome. Let me know if you can see my browser window. Should just be blank right now. Okay. So again, not that we haven't ever gone through this, right? But just to make this clear. So like clicking through this link, you're going to see right away there's an ad down here, right? I scroll through, here's another ad. And then I scroll down, up, there's the ad. Get out of the way, please. And then, up, there's another ad. And I keep scrolling, oh, there's another ad. Horrible user experience, just absolutely atrocious. And that's part of the reason why all of these websites in this conglomerate keep getting shuttered, but that's besides the point. So all that to say, please don't do that. Please don't be that developer. If you need ads, totally makes sense. Just please don't do that. So for today's lab, it really, and I don't know if you get it, lab dog. I know we didn't really go over this last time. So as a reminder, there's a certain amount of labs that you need to do, right, to get your different certificates. I'm not sure what each of those are. So if you are still short on some labs, this would be a good one for you to work on. It's a little bit more robust, but I'm just going to go ahead and walk through what's expected for this. Again, this kind of ties in with 11.3. It's the same lab. We just didn't have time to fully go over it the other day. So if you had the ability or the time to do this one, what's expected for this lab is you are going to be creating a mock-up for a website called Pause, like Pause, but also Pause. Okay. So by doing this, what you would do is have a list of business and customer needs for this website. You would create a prospective customer using a persona, similar to what we did in 11.2. You would make a sitemap and then a low fidelity wireframe. Now, what you'd want to do, however, is to be able to combine all of those into a single file. So if you've never done that before, this website here, combinedpdf.com, is a great way to do that. Now, as always, any website like this, just be aware there's, they may say, what do we do with your data, right? I can't verify that, but obviously you're not putting any sensitive data in here, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. But be wary, just anytime you use a public facing website like this, if it's for company related stuff, don't do it, right? You need to do that internally. So the scenario here will capture everything if you decide again to do the specific lab. Because we're going to give you the rest of the time here. We have about 40 minutes. We're going to give you some time to keep working on your project 10, or if you are done and you need some labs to complete, or if you need time for that, we're going to give you this time as well. As you've noticed, and I had kind of prefaced this, the UI UX lessons are a little light, but they're still important, right? And to Sarah's question earlier, being able to, how do you integrate these kind of, just the thought process of like interviews and such in the actual design process. Obviously, I wasn't prepared for that because I asked that question and he uh, answered with his own question, but we can talk about that as well. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes for that. So really thinking about the information gathering of a project, right? So first and foremost, you need to be able to deploy the application, right? And we haven't quite got to that lesson yet when it comes to taking your code and deploying it to GitHub and then deploying it somewhere else, right? But first things first is you need to be able to even have your application visible. So again, you could do a GitHub prototype, or maybe you're just wanting to share your actual application publicly. So really the first thing to understand is who is your client, right? Are you going to have multiple clients? Is it going to be one client? So if I'm going to talk about my brother-in-law's project that I've been working on for him, again, I've had to take a bit of a break, as you can see here, about 6 months ago. So this is the public-facing version of the application, right? Now it's not going to work because my Supabase account, if you remember, was paused. But if I go in and let's see, maybe I can actually, I think I still have it locally. Where's VS Code? Oh, you know what? I never did reinstall VS Code after I stopped using JetBrains. Okay. So let me trying to think of how I want to do this. Still Supabase client. Yeah, we could do that. I think we can do that. All right. Let's open up. Okay. Make a download a database backup. Okay. I'm going to delete this project. I'm not gonna have this happen again. Okay. All right. I'm just gonna do password right now. Oh, it won't let me do that. Okay. It won't even let me do that. Let me want to be able to demonstrate this, and it might hit notes. Let's make a new note. I think it'll, yep. Okay. So I'm going to be doing some stuff here that we haven't gone over, but I just want to be able to view this project. So if I go into database and yeah, I may not be able to do this today. Can we actually stop recording for a second? So the reason I bring up this project is because he has clients. So developing for him, what I'm working on is having a application that's twofold, right? I want a dashboard where he can go in and upload photos of a current job that he's working on. He can post updates for a client. He can go through and send invoice requests through this, right? And then on the client perspective, they should be able to go in and view the status of their restoration, right? So if they have any questions, they don't have to ask him, "Hey, where are we at?" Right? They can go in and see when was the last time something was updated. What is my bill currently? Things like that. So when it comes to user testing, there's really going to be two forms of user testing for me with this application, right? Is A, with my brother-in-law, are you able to upload everything easily, right? Does it make sense? Can you do it on your phone? Can you do it on your computer? Um, what is your experience with using it? But then also, I'm going to have to get feedback from the clients as well, which is going to be a little weird. This is going to be one of the first times where I'm making a more public facing application like this on my own. So I will have to figure out ways to prompt for that feedback, right? I'm not going to really sit down with people and do one-on-one interviews, I don't think, because it's such a niche application, right? You're not going to have people who are just going on the app store and finding this. It's just going to be a web-based browser. And my brother-in-law is going to be in charge of who is able to access, right? But the point is, there's going to be two different ways that I'm going to be getting information from people. It's going to be my brother-in-law as one, and then also his clients. I will have to be getting feedback as well, whether that's directly or through him. So that's where thinking through this information gathering process is really important, right? Where maybe your user interviews are not going to be as formal as what we've talked about. But when you are the one developing and designing, it's important to not just be like, hey, I designed it, it's good. And if there's any issues, it's all on the other people, right? Especially this early in your journey in your career, you need to be open to the fact that maybe maybe I'm not as clear on this as I should be. Maybe it's not as user friendly as it should be. Okay. Does that kind of help at all as far as like understanding how you're wanting to design, like even if it's not a full blown company you're designing for, like it is still important to understand who's going to be using your application and preparing yourself for that process there. Okay. So we've got 30 minutes. Obviously, you're more than welcome to work on project, but do we have anything that you all would like to see while we have this time, especially with the project due tomorrow? I want to make sure we get a little bit of FaceTime here too. If anyone's uh, got something they're stuck on, right, we can talk about that. We can try to troubleshoot, obviously, without sharing your code. So. It looks like Sarah's typing. Okay. I've got to read this out, which is super important, right? So, as Sarah said, want to share something funny that happened to me working on my code. Was getting errors, couldn't sleep, just thinking of how to resolve, add contact. But after two sleepless nights, there was just a typo. You had added an S to props or to prop, right? So instead of, um, it is just a typo. And yeah, I've been there for sure. I think as you progress, two sleepless nights just ends up being 2 10-minute periods of being extremely frustrated and aggravated. But the whole situation is just it never ceases to fail. Like that's where getting into things like TypeScript is so helpful, because then you realize like, oh, I get an error right away that says something's wrong instead of like really trying to narrow down the problem because my whatever framework I'm using doesn't read that as an error. So definitely sorry you went through that, but I'm glad you got it figured out. That's helpful. So any other questions or thoughts? Otherwise, like I said, we'll just spend the rest of the time working on your project. And obviously you can uh, drop something in the chat as we're sitting here. But I just want to make sure we have that full time where any questions at all, like I'm happy to answer any tech questions, job, day-to-day stuff. Make sure we can use this time. Okay, time I'd say we could go ahead and stop recording, put some music on, and let people work. But if something comes up, I will come off mute to address. All right. Well, it is 26 after. Veronica, Time, do you have anything you would like to share before